Jack froze. Before him stood a man who shouldn't be alive, Mark Reeves, his friend, missing for 10 years. But Mark wasn't looking at him. He was looking at the puppy in Jack's arms, and then, in a whisper, he said, "You found her." What happened next changed everything. But let's start from the beginning. A lone silhouette in the snow. The Colorado mountains were never welcoming in the winter. But tonight, nature seemed determined to test all living things. The wind whipped up swirling snow, blanketing everything in a white shroud. The temperature was plummeting, and even the forest, usually filled with the creak of branches and the occasional cry of a night bird, had fallen into an eerie silence. Somewhere in this frozen wasteland, barely visible in the darkness, a small German shepherd trudged forward. Her steps were unsteady, her paws sinking into deep drifts, her breath coming in heavy, ragged gasps that instantly frosted over on her muzzle. Each new gust of wind stole more of her strength. Her small body trembled, but she kept moving, not because she wanted to, because she had to. She didn't remember how she got here. Her memories were blurred, like footprints in the snow, quickly erased by the next wave of icy powder. The last thing etched into her mind was the warmth of hands, a voice, and then the sound of a door slamming shut. Snow clung to her fur, covering her in a thin layer of frost. She tried to shake it off, but only managed to stumble. Her eyes, once bright with curiosity, had grown dull. She tried to listen, to find something, anything, but there was only emptiness. The cold crept closer, wrapping around her, making every movement torture. She tried to whimper, but only a faint, broken squeak came out. She couldn't fight anymore. Her strength was slipping away. She slowed. Her legs shook beneath her. One more step, then another. But each one felt like a leap into the abyss. The wind howled, stealing the last traces of warmth. Her head spun. She wanted to lie down, to close her eyes. The scent of hope. But then, something cut through the wall of cold. A scent, faint, barely there, but real. Her nose, numb from the cold, picked up something familiar, something ancient, something that meant life. Smoke. A blend of charcoal, burning logs, and the heat of a fire carried on the wind. It was salvation. Her eyes cleared just a little. Where there was smoke, there was warmth. Where there was warmth, there was a human. And where there was a human, there was a chance to survive. Her instincts, dulled by the cold, reawakened. She took a step, then another. Her legs trembled, her breathing grew heavier, but she pushed forward, chasing that fragile hope. And somewhere beyond the veil of snow, she had no idea, someone was already looking for her. A call in the night. The crackling of logs filled the cabin with a warm, steady rhythm. Flames licked lazily at the dry wood, sending sparks into the old stone fireplace. Jack Carter sat in his worn leather chair, cradling a steaming mug of coffee. His gaze was fixed on the fire, but his thoughts drifted far beyond the quiet of his home. He was a veteran. Afghanistan, the desert, the unbearable heat. It was all in the past, but the years of service had left their mark. He knew what cold felt like. He knew what it meant to fight for life when there was nothing left to give. Tonight was supposed to be just another night, but something felt off. A feeling. It came out of nowhere, like a shadow creeping over his mind. A dull, pressing sense of unease. He couldn't explain it. He just felt it. Jack slowly set his mug down and stood. He walked to the window. Outside, the storm raged. A white wall of snow swallowed the world, but he swore he heard something. He held his breath. A faint sound cut through the wind. A whimper. Barely audible, but real. Jack frowned. Listened. The sound came again. Weak. Desperate. Without another second of hesitation, he grabbed his coat, pulled on his gloves, snatched a flashlight, and threw open the door. The wind hit him like a frozen whip. But Jack was already moving forward, chasing that barely there sound. Someone out there. Someone was dying. And he wasn't about to let that happen. Fighting the cold. The blizzard grew fiercer. The wind carried sharp ice pellets that bit into Jack Carter's skin like tiny needles. He pushed forward through the white abyss, his flashlight cutting a weak beam into the swirling storm, barely illuminating the path ahead. Then, a sound. A desperate whimper, laced with pain and exhaustion, still echoed somewhere ahead. But with each step, it was growing weaker. Jack quickened his pace. The snow crunched under his heavy military boots, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. But he couldn't stop. Then, across his path, a faint, dark line. Tracks. Barely visible, already being swallowed by the relentless snowfall. But they were there. Small paw prints scattered chaotically across the white expanse. Jack narrowed his eyes, following the direction. A dog. He'd seen tracks like these before, in war zones, where military dogs walked beside soldiers, carrying out missions just as vital as any man's. He knew the prints of strays, those who had learned the streets and followed a path with purpose. But these tracks were erratic, looping, crisscrossing. She was lost, disoriented, running out of strength, searching for a way out. Jack didn't hesitate. He pressed forward, moving faster. Finding her in time. It had been no more than 5 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Then, in the weak glow of his flashlight, he saw her. A small, snow-covered bundle of fur. Jack's heart clenched. He dropped to his knees. "Damn it," he breathed, carefully brushing the snow away from the tiny body. A German shepherd puppy. She wasn't moving, but her chest still rose and fell, slow, barely perceptible. "Hang in there, girl," Jack murmured, gently touching her side. Her body was ice cold. Frost clung to her fur. The pads of her paws were so frozen they had turned an unsettling shade of pale. A little longer out here, and she wouldn't have made it. The pup shivered weakly, letting out the faintest broken whimper. But she didn't open her eyes. Jack wasted no time. He unzipped his jacket, wrapped her inside, and pressed her close to his chest. He had to warm her up, fast, or she wouldn't stand a chance. And that's when he noticed something. The old tag around her neck, hidden beneath matted fur, was an old leather collar. Worn, battered, but still intact. Jack frowned. She wasn't a stray. Someone had loved her. But then, he saw it. Attached to the collar, a metal tag, a military tag. Jack froze. The snow continued to fall, but time itself seemed to stop. No way. Slowly, he uncurled his fingers and lifted the tag to the light. The metal was ice cold, the numbers barely legible beneath layers of dirt and frost. But when he made them out, his world stopped. Sergeant Mark Reeves, missing in action, Afghanistan 2011. Mark Reeves. Jack's heart slammed against his ribs. He wasn't breathing. He knew that name. A past he had tried to bury came crashing back, hitting him with the force of the storm. Mark. His partner. The man who had vanished 10 years ago. But if he had gone missing in Afghanistan, how the hell was his dog tag here, in the middle of a Colorado blizzard, around the neck of this dying puppy? Ghosts of the past. The fire in the hearth burned brighter, but Jack felt no warmth. A cold knot of unease coiled inside him. The puppy, wrapped in his old army blanket, breathed faintly. Her tiny body still trembled, but her fur was beginning to dry, and her breathing had steadied. Jack ran a hand over his face, trying to collect his thoughts. He had just found a dying puppy in the middle of a snowstorm. That alone was strange. But now things had taken a turn he never could have anticipated, because around her neck had been a military dog tag. Sergeant Mark Reeves, missing in action, Afghanistan 2011. The words had cut through him, dragging up memories he had buried deep. His chest tightened. Mark Reeves, the man he had gone through hell with, the man who was closer than a brother, the man who had vanished 10 years ago, and Jack remembered it all, every last detail. The mission that changed everything. Afghanistan 2011. They moved under cover of darkness. 5 men, silent, focused, tense glances exchanged. Radio chatter a low murmur against the wind. Their mission was simple: scout an insurgent camp, relay coordinates to command, and get out before dawn. But nothing went as planned. The first bullet whizzed past Jack's head. Then came the explosions. The ground shook beneath them. It was an ambush. Shouts, gunfire, muzzle flashes piercing the night. And through the chaos, Jack remembered him. Mark holding the line, holding them together. "Go!" Mark had shouted, tossing Jack a spare magazine. "No! Stay close!" But Mark hadn't listened. He covered their retreat, until he disappeared. One moment he was there, firing, moving, fighting. The next, gone. No scream, no gunshot, no explosion, just silence. Just gone. Unanswered questions. Jack had searched for him, for days, until their unit was pulled back, then for weeks, filing reports, pushing command to launch a full search. But it had all been useless. Mark was listed as missing in action. The official report suggested insurgents might have taken him, or that his body had been obliterated in the blast. Jack never believed it. Mark wouldn't just vanish. He was too stubborn, too damn skilled. If he had been alive, he would have found a way back. But years passed, and even Jack, with a clenched jaw and a heavy heart, accepted the inevitable. Mark was gone. Until tonight, when his past came knocking in the form of a half-frozen puppy with his dog tag. The search for answers. Jack exhaled slowly and stood. The pup lay curled near the fire, sleeping, but his mind raced. He needed answers. With a heavy heart, he sat down at his old laptop and powered it on. The screen flickered to life in the dimly lit room. If the tag was real, if it wasn't some kind of forgery. Jack quickly typed the serial number into the military database. The result loaded in seconds. Status: missing in action. Date: November 3rd, 2011. Nothing new. Gritting his teeth, he was about to close the page when his eye caught a small link at the bottom. Additional archived reports. He clicked. A new page opened. The file was classified, but not beyond his clearance. Report on possible service member sighting. Date: 3 years ago. Jack's mouth went dry. The report detailed multiple sightings of a man matching Mark's description in a small town near Colorado Springs. The first, at a cafe. The second, at a gas station. The third, at a grocery store. A security guard had noted the man's strange behavior. He avoided people, spoke to no one. But there was something about his eyes. A look the guard never forgot. A look of someone who had seen too much. A soldier's eyes. Jack's fists clenched. One more detail stood out. A woman's statement. A local who claimed to have seen him walking with a dog. She had described him as lost. Like a man who didn't know who he was anymore. Jack's pulse pounded. If the report was right, if Mark had been in Colorado just 3 years ago, then he could still be alive. Why didn't he come back? But if Mark was alive, why hadn't he come back? Why hadn't he reached out? And what the hell did this puppy mean? Jack shut the laptop and stood abruptly. He couldn't just sit here. He had to find out the truth, and he knew exactly where to start. The search that could change everything. The sun was just beginning to rise over the snow-covered mountains as Jack stepped outside. The sky was painted in soft shades of pink and lavender, but his mind was far from appreciating its beauty. In the trunk of his old SUV, wrapped snugly in a warm blanket, the little puppy slept. She was still weak, but her breathing was deeper now, her fur slowly regaining its natural texture. Jack slid behind the wheel, eyes fixed on the map. A small town near Colorado Springs, the last known place where Mark had been seen. He couldn't think about anything else. If this lead turned out to be false, if he was chasing a ghost. But something inside him whispered he was on the right path. He started the engine, and the tires crunched softly over the snow as he drove away. Questions and answers. It took hours to reach the town. It was small, old-fashioned, the kind of place where life moved at its own slow rhythm, where people knew each other by name, and strangers were noticed instantly. Jack parked at a gas station, stepping out to stretch his stiff muscles. He knew his search could be a dead end. People might not remember, or they might not want to talk. But he had no choice. He pulled out an old photograph of Mark every time he walked into a store, a diner, a gas station. Most people only shrugged. Never seen him. Might have been through here once, but I'm not sure. No, doesn't look familiar. Hope was slipping away. Until, in a small cafe behind the counter, stood an elderly woman. When Jack placed the photograph in front of her, her eyes widened slightly. "This man," she murmured. Jack leaned in. "You know him?" She squinted, as if recalling a distant memory. "He comes in sometimes, keeps to himself, hardly speaks, orders only coffee, and sits in the corner. I'd say he's military. I've seen men like him before. They have a different look in their eyes." Jack's heart pounded. "Where does he live?" The woman wiped her hands on a cloth and motioned northward. "A cabin, maybe 10 kilometers outside of town, deep in the woods. They say he lives alone." A door to the past. The road to the cabin was narrow and winding. His tires carved tracks through the untouched snow, the silence of the forest pressing in around him. Every turn brought him closer to the truth. Could it really be Mark? Then, through the trees, the cabin appeared. Simple but sturdy. Smoke curled from the chimney in a thin, steady stream. Jack killed the engine and stepped out. For a long moment, he simply stood there, studying the house. He didn't know what he would find behind that door, but he knew it was time to find out. Taking a deep breath, he stepped onto the porch and knocked. Silence. His heart pounded in his ears. He knocked again. This time he heard movement inside. The door creaked open. And there, standing before him, was Mark Reeves, the man who vanished. At first, Jack didn't believe his eyes. The man before him looked older, worn. His face was marked with scars, his eyes sunken with exhaustion, his hair longer than Jack had ever seen it. But it was him. Mark, alive. For a moment, neither man spoke. Jack saw the storm of emotions in Mark's gaze. Shock, fear, disbelief, and recognition. Mark was the first to break the silence. "Jack?" His voice was rough, as if he hadn't spoken that name in years. But Jack didn't answer. Instead, he slowly lowered his eyes and stepped forward, holding out the puppy. Mark froze. The tiny creature, still drowsy, blinked groggily at him. Mark didn't move, but Jack saw something shift in his expression. Another second, and then Mark's face crumbled. "You found her," he whispered, his voice shaking. The puppy lifted her head, looked at him, and then, as if recognizing him, her little tail gave a faint, weak wag. Mark dropped to his knees. His hands trembled as he reached out, as if afraid that if he touched her too suddenly, she might disappear. The puppy nudged her nose into his palm. Mark pulled her close, and his shoulders shook. Jack said nothing. He didn't need to, because everything he needed to know, he already understood. Mark hadn't been dead. He had been lost, broken, but now, because of a little puppy, and because of the choice Jack had made that night, he had finally found his way home.